As we've seen, you can create functions that take objects as parameters. And we've also seen that functions are a type of object in JavaScript. So if you put those two concepts together, what it means is that you can pass functions into other functions as arguments. Or, alternatively, you can write functions that take other functions as parameters. Now, in terms of general programming, there is a term for that. When you can pass functions around like any other piece of data, we say that functions are first class. So we'd say that functions in JavaScript are first class, which is just a shorthand way of saying you can pass functions into other functions as parameters. Now, some of these higher order functions, and a higher order function is a function that takes another function as a parameter, some of them are built into the language. So for example, there are some methods on arrays which are higher order. So let's look at one of those. So let's say I define an array, var an array is equal to 3, 5, 7, 1, 2. Now, an array has a method called forEach. So if I say an array.forEach, you see there's a function there. And forEach is a higher order function that takes a single function as a parameter. So the way I would use forEach is I would pass it a function that takes one argument, and then what forEach is going to do is it's going to call that function I pass in on each element of this array one after the other. So for example, an array.forEach function that takes an item and then console.logs item. So close off the function I'm passing in, close off forEach, and return. So I call console.log 5 times, once on each of the items in this list. So forEach is a higher order function. It's actually a higher order method because it's running as a property on the array. And then this anonymous function here is being passed in as a parameter to forEach. Now another example that's built into JavaScript is the array method map. So an array.map, this is just like forEach in that it takes a function that takes each element one after the other. But here, the return value of the function is going to be glued together into a new array. So for example, function sub item return, and then here I'm going to figure out whether each element is odd or even. So I can tell that 3 is even if I take 3 mod 2. If the value it returns is 0, so 3 divided by 2 is 1 with 1 left over. So I know that since the return value of 3 mod 2 is 1, I know that this is odd. This one, 2 divided by 2 is 1 with 0 left over. So if I take 2 mod 2, I know this is even because it returns 0 mod 2. So if I return item mod 2, if this is 0, then it's even. If it's 1, then it's odd. And since 0 is a falsy value and 1 is a truthy value, I can say question mark odd colon even. So what this is going to do, close off the anonymous function, close off the map, is this is going to return an array that's parallel to an array where it's either going to be even or odd for each element in the original array, like so. So 3 is odd, 5 is odd, 7 is odd, 1 is odd, 2 is even. Or if I say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 dot map, and then pass in this function, odd, even, odd, even, odd, even, odd. Now, I can also write this not using an anonymous function. So for example, function is even takes a number and returns number mod 2 question odd colon even. So there's a function is even 1 is even 5 2. Then I can write this map statement, and array.map is even. So that behaves just like when I passed in the anonymous function that took one argument, except here I can just put the name of the function. And in fact, any function that takes one parameter can be passed in to map. So since you can pass a function in as a parameter to another function, we can use that here in our little counter example as well. So I'm going to, instead of returning the counter from increment and decrement, what I want to do instead is do something with the counter. So I want to pass in a function to make a counter, and then every time I change the value of counter, I want to call that function on the new value. So I'm going to call that a callback function. So this function is going to get called back with whatever the new value of counter is instead of just returning counter. So to do that, I'm going to call callback on counter. And same thing here, callback on counter. So now when I make my decrement and increment functions, they're going to be closed over not only counter, but also this callback. So I can reuse this code to create counters that do a bunch of different things. So let's go ahead and save here and reload. And the first thing I'll do is I'll set counter1 to make a counter. And this one is just going to take a function that has a value, which is going to be the value of my counter, and it's just going to console.log that value. So here's a version that just writes the value to the console every time I call increment or decrement. So counter1.inc writes to the console, and counter1.dec also writes to the console rather. So here's another version. I'm going to go ahead and in my HTML, I'm going to go ahead and add a div box with ID equal count, and then reload. And let's go ahead and make the same counter one we had before. So it should work the same, counter dec, counter inc. But now, for my second counter, that's going to be make a counter, and it's going to be a function that takes the value of my current counter, and it's going to say document.getElement by ID count dot inner text equal value. So now instead of writing the new value to the console each time, this counter should actually display the value on the web page. So counter2.inc, and you'll see that this number here is changing. Counter2.dec, right? So I'm reusing all that stuff about the counter and the closure for two entirely different displays.